You confuse scale with immunity. You believe that if you just stockpile enough resources, hire enough bodies, and amass enough capital, you can permanently insulate yourself from the basic laws of physics and consequence. You think volume can compensate for a total lack of competence. You are born into a system that works, or you inherit a machine built by men far harder than you, and you mistake the humming of their engine for the sound of your own genius. When you never have to bleed to acquire power, you develop a fatal misunderstanding of how the universe responds to it. You start to believe that reality is a subordinate. You assume that failure is just a middle management problem, a clerical error that can be solved by throwing more money at the bonfire. You do not understand that the world does not care about your crown. It only cares about what you actually built and what you actually destroyed to feel like you'd built it. In 480 BCE, the earth groaned under the weight of the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. The Achaemenid Empire of Persia was mobilized for a single, obsessive purpose: the annihilation of Greece. At the center of this apocalyptic swarm sat Xerxes, the first king of kings, the Shahanshah. Xerxes was the quintessential heir. He did not forge the Persian Empire in the fires of conquest. His grandfather, Cyrus the Great, built it out of mud and blood. His father, Darius, organized it into an administrative juggernaut. Xerxes simply woke up one morning and inherited the earth. He was raised in the intoxicating, sterilized bubble of the Persepolis palaces, surrounded by courtiers whose only job was to ensure his feet never touched the dirt and his ears never heard the word no. Before we get to Greece, though, there's a piece of this man's own record, his own words, carved by his own order, still standing today, that tells you more about how his mind actually worked than any battlefield story ever could. Early in his reign, a province within the empire rose in rebellion. Rebellions were not unusual in an empire this size, and most Achaemenid kings responded to them with a fairly standard playbook: crush the uprising, execute the ringleaders, install a loyal governor, move on. Xerxes did something considerably stranger and considerably more revealing. He left behind a stone inscription discovered by archaeologists and preserved to this day, now known as the Daiva Inscription. In his own carved words, he describes what happened after the rebellion was suppressed. He didn't simply punish the people who rose against him. He describes systematically destroying the sanctuaries where they worshipped their local gods. Gods the inscription refers to using the term Daiva, a word loaded with contempt in the Zoroastrian tradition Xerxes followed, roughly meaning false or demonic spirits masquerading as gods. He describes outlawing their worship entirely and forcing the population toward exclusive devotion to Ahura Mazda, the deity of the Persian royal house. It's worth being precise about why this particular document has drawn so much attention from historians who study the period, because it's genuinely rare among Achaemenid royal inscriptions. Most surviving Persian royal texts from this era, including several from Xerxes' own father Darius, go out of their way to project an image of religious tolerance, local gods respected, local customs preserved, conquered peoples left largely alone to worship as they always had. Because that tolerance was itself a deliberate and effective strategy for administering a genuinely vast, multi-ethnic empire without constant rebellion. The Daiva inscription breaks from that pattern so sharply that scholars still debate exactly what triggered it. What isn't in dispute is what the text itself says in Xerxes' own commissioned words about what he did and why he considered it worth memorializing in stone. Sit with what this actually represents, because it's easy to read past a sentence like that without registering the scale of what it describes. This was not a king punishing rebellious soldiers or seizing rebellious territory, which was ordinary business for an empire of this size. This was a king reaching into the private religious lives of an entire population and attempting to physically and legally erase what they believed, replacing it by decree with what he believed, and then having the confidence to carve that erasure into stone as an accomplishment worth boasting about for eternity. This is the tantrum of a childish mind reaching for the largest possible toy. It's the calculated confidence of someone who has never once encountered a limit on what his will can rewrite, applied not to armies or treasuries, but to the actual contents of other people's minds. A general who has fought his way to power understands that people's beliefs are stubborn, private, and expensive to change by force. A man who inherited his throne with no resistance ever offered to him at any point in his life has no reason to have learned that lesson yet. And the Daiva Inscription reads like a man discovering the limits of his own power for the first time, one erased temple at a time. Persepolis itself, the ceremonial heart of the empire, tells the same story in architecture instead of stone inscriptions. Xerxes commissioned the Gate of All Nations, a massive ceremonial entrance flanked by colossal stone lamassu, winged bulls with human heads, carved at a scale designed to make any visitor feel physically insignificant the moment they cross the threshold. Every foreign delegation arriving to pay tribute to the Persian court was forced to walk beneath these monsters before they ever reached a throne room, before a single word of negotiation had been exchanged, before the actual business of diplomacy had even begun. This was not decoration. It was a calculated psychological weapon built out of stone, engineered to establish dominance before any conversation could take place on equal footing. A delegation from a smaller kingdom, walking beneath towering carved monsters into a hall built specifically to communicate the futility of resistance, arrived at the negotiating table already defeated in spirit, regardless of what terms they'd actually traveled there to discuss. Xerxes understood, at least instinctively, that architecture could do to a visiting ambassador's confidence what an army could do to an actual battlefield. Soften it, break it, make submission feel like the only reasonable outcome before anyone had spoken. The surviving reliefs at Persepolis carry the same message in a different form, carved rows of delegates from across the empire: Egyptians, Ethiopians, Indians, Bactrians, depicted marching in orderly procession, each bearing tribute, each rendered in an identical, submissive posture, regardless of how powerful or independent their actual kingdom had been before Persian conquest. The stone doesn't record these nations as they saw themselves. It records them exactly as Xerxes wanted the world to remember them: interchangeable, compliant, permanently arranged in a hierarchy with his own throne at the top. This is propaganda carved to outlast any living witness who might have disagreed with it. There's a specific kind of arrogance embedded in this approach that deserves to be named directly. An insecure ruler builds defenses. A ruler who has never once doubted his own centrality to the universe builds monuments designed purely to remind everyone else of that centrality, at enormous cost, purely for the psychological effect. Every stone in that gate, every hour of labor extracted from thousands of workers to carve those bulls, existed for exactly one purpose: making sure nobody who walked through it ever needed to ask who was in charge. You are building your own gate of all nations right now, and you don't even realize you're doing it. You sit in a corner office bought with someone else's equity, watching your inheritance burn. You inherited a legacy brand, a family fortune, or a massive round of venture capital, and you used it to build a bloated, sluggish organization, hiring thousands of people to do the job of 10, confusing headcount with velocity. You rented the most expensive real estate specifically because impressing visitors mattered more to you than whether the business underneath the address actually worked. You launched vanity projects designed entirely to feed your ego, ignoring the jagged rocks of the actual market waiting for you outside the lobby. Watch how this shows up specifically in the small, expensive rituals a struggling company keeps investing in, even as the fundamentals rot. The oversized headquarters nobody actually needs. The keynote stage built to make the founder look like a visionary prophet instead of an operator with a spreadsheet problem. The legal team assembled not primarily to solve real disputes, but to intimidate smaller competitors into silence before a single court date is ever scheduled. Every one of these is a smaller, cheaper version of the gate of all nations. Architecture and theater built to establish dominance before the actual competition has even started. Purchased instead of earned. None of this is subtle once you know to look for it. And once you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere. The company whose annual report reads like scripture. The founder whose keynote slides look more like religious iconography than a product roadmap. The office lobby with the 12-foot logo mounted specifically so every visitor has to crane their neck upward to take it in. The exact same architectural trick the Gate of All Nations used on ambassadors 25 centuries earlier. Scale used honestly protects something real underneath it. Scale used as theater is simply a more expensive way of hoping nobody looks too closely at what's actually inside the building. And when a startup with a fraction of your budget and zero respect for your pedigree slips past your gate and starts tearing your market share to pieces anyway, what do? You fire the engineers, you yell at the consultants, you throw millions of dollars at a PR firm to rewrite the narrative. You draft aggressive, unhinged legal threats, trying to sue the competition out of existence instead of outbuilding them. You sit behind your gate and demand that the market respect your pedigree. The market does not care about your seed round, your llama shoe, or the size of the gate you built to keep the small companies feeling small. The market rewards whatever actually works, indifferent to how much stone you piled up trying to convince everyone otherwise. Look, too, at the heir who inherits a thriving family fortune and treats a marriage certificate the same way Xerxes treated a conquered province, as territory to be governed rather than a relationship to be earned. They rely entirely on the gravity of the contract, the size of the ring, the visible scale of what they've provided, to keep a partner compliant while offering absolute contempt in exchange. They believe the legal document functions the way Xerxes believed his inscriptions functioned. A permanent, binding erasure of whatever the other person actually wants, replaced by decree with what serves the person holding the pen. When the partner finally packs their bags and walks out anyway, the heir is genuinely stunned. They scream. They threaten. They cannot compute that a human being, unlike a conquered province, was never actually required to keep believing in the God they were ordered to worship. There is a real distinction worth drawing before this lesson gets applied too bluntly to every large or ambitious project you ever encounter. Because scale itself isn't the crime here. Cyrus and Darius, the men who actually built this empire, also commissioned massive architecture, also demanded tribute, also ruled through genuine hierarchy. The difference was never the size of what they built. It was whether the scale served something functioning underneath it, or whether the scale existed purely to disguise the absence of anything functioning at all. A gate built to protect a genuinely capable empire is a fortification. A gate built by a man who has never once been tested, purely to make sure nobody notices he's never been tested, is a mask, and masks eventually slip regardless of how expensive the stone underneath them was. The practical test worth applying to your own ambitions before you commission your own version of a Golden Gate is simple enough to ask honestly. Does this investment make the underlying operation genuinely stronger, or does it simply make the operation look stronger to people who haven't yet had a reason to look closely? Darius built roads, standardized currency, organized a functioning postal system across an empire the size of a continent. Infrastructure that did real, measurable work, regardless of who was watching. Xerxes largely inherited that machine and spent a significant share of his own reign polishing its reflection. History remembers the difference, even when the polish was expensive enough to survive 25 centuries in the sand. Stop relying on the sheer weight of your resources to protect you from reality. Scale is not a substitute for strategy. Money is not a substitute for competence. Strip away your title, your bank account, and the infrastructure built by the ghosts of better men who came before you, and you are left with the brutal truth of what you actually are, unshielded by any of it. If you build an empire on the assumption that other people's minds can simply be conquered by decree, the way Xerxes assumed a mountain village's gods could be erased with a chisel, you will spend enormous resources achieving something that looks, from a distance, exactly like victory, and turns out up close to be nothing but an inscription nobody actually believes, carved into a monument nobody actually respects, guarding an empire that was already hollow the day the stonemasons finished their work. Persepolis itself was eventually burned, roughly a century and a half after Xerxes commissioned that gate, torched by the army of a conqueror who understood exactly what the architecture had represented and exactly how little it had actually protected. The lamassus still stand today, weathered but intact, having outlasted the empire they were built to intimidate on behalf of by well over 2,000 years. Stone remembers the ambition. It has no obligation to remember whether the ambition was ever justified.